The concept of doing water reuse is always a local issue. There is always an interest that is based on local situations, local availability of resources, local needs, and local uses. However, there is so much in common, and the Water Reuse Association has been able to collectively have our members and their representatives join together to jointly do research that is common to all of us, to jointly meet together and discuss topics that are common to all of us and that become examples for others to use.
Well, I've been involved with recycled water since the 1970s, actually, when I worked on my first groundwater recharge project for a consulting firm. After that, I worked in water reuse for a water utility, and then got involved in regulation with the state of California. So I have a long history in water reuse, and it's been fascinating watching the science and the regulation and the industry develop over those years. I think the big changes that have occurred over my career are the science that we base our regulation on and our understanding of what actually is important. Regulation needs a sound scientific basis. Any gaps or ambiguity in the science leads to regulator uncertainty that is dealt with using very conservative requirements. Water reuse and others have been responsible for research that has allowed very effective and efficient regulations, much better than we had in previous decades.
Well, when I got out of graduate school from the University of Texas in 1977, I was working for the Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts, and my state, California was coming off of a really bad drought, and people were pretty desperate to use recycled water, and particularly for recharging groundwater. But the state had just convened a panel that said, we need to do all this research before, there can be regulations for groundwater recharge. And my first job, right out of school, was to do a feasibility study to see if we could even do this research, and if we did the research, how would we do it? So I got to be the project manager of a $3 million multidisciplinary project looking at the health effects of using recycled water for groundwater replenishment, based on primarily the Montebello Forebay project, which had been in operation since 1960. It's changed in so many ways. I mean, the most obvious is technologically, in terms of treatment and monitoring and being able to evaluate projects. The toolkit's gotten a lot fancier.
Well, my experience with reuse began in the early 1980s. I was practicing in the Tampa area, and we were under an extreme growth spurt. And my first revelation in dealing with reuse, I was involved in a project from South Hillsborough County, and we were routing a transmission line to go to a golf course to dispose of reclaimed water. And the utility at the time decided that to overcome opposition in neighborhoods for the pipeline to go down one side or the other, they were going to give an incentive to people who were on the short side of a street to allow them to have access to reclaimed water. And much to my surprise, whereas most times people would argue about keep the pipe away from me, put it on the other side, we had quite the opposite experience. People were demanding the pipe be on their side because they wanted reclaimed water. So the light bulb went off in my eyes and many other eyes that this was a resource whose time had come. And we're now starting to see in the public starting to demand an even higher and better use of the reclaimed water. And we're seeing many communities restrict the use of public access reuse and start to focus more on indirect, and much to my surprise, more quickly than I thought it would have happened, some very serious discussions on direct potable reuse.
First project that I worked on actively that was involved total reuse was Water Factory 21. Orange County had built the water factory, and we were retained to work with Dave Argo there and help design an RO plant. A lot of major changes took place. First, the Bridging regulations in the Clean Water Act which were promulgated in 83, took full force. And so the toxic chemicals that were in municipal sewage when we were looking at the 70s and 80s were absent by the end of the 90s. Today, most secondary effluents meet the chemical standards for drinking water. Second is the high-tech revolution came into the water industry. Technologies like membrane filtration, RO, ozonation, advanced oxidation, UV light were much more powerful than the sand filtration and chlorination that we were trying to use back in the 70s and 80s, or line treatment. High-tech also improved our ability to monitor and control water quality. We have a dense population, we have water scarcity, we have global warming, we have a lot of circumstances that are presenting challenges. And I think water reuse and using our used water is going to be one of the important things we're going to have to learn to do in order to manage that challenge.
When I came to El Paso in 89, the Fred Hervey water reclamation plant had been built in 85. It's an indirect potable reuse plant, injected into the groundwater table, wastewater plant followed by a water plant. I am told that there was quite a bit of discussion and public hearings, to get public acceptance at that time, which, this is probably back in the late 1970s, to get acceptance to take wastewater, treat it to a drinking water standard, and inject it into the aquifer was not known really at that time. And as mentioned earlier, the Factory 21 work was going on in California, kind of very similar. But since then, this plant has been operating successfully since 1985 and has been expanded since then and continues to do a wonderful job. So it's in these engineered systems. It has come about. Public acceptance has come a long way. Obviously, there's still a long way to go. It's all site-specific, in my opinion. Every project is very different, very unique, and has to be analyzed very carefully. I do think there's been, major improvements in the water treatment train, which has seen cost reductions.
So when I began working on water reuse in the late 1990s, it was primarily with indirect potable reuse and often what we would call now de facto water reuse. And the greatest change I've seen is the advancement very quickly in the last few years towards direct potable reuse. And because I work in Singapore 3 months out of every year, I've become more accustomed to what New Water's done in bottling their recycled water. And to watch the U.S. advance in direct potable reuse is the largest change I've experienced. So recently in my career, I'm working in southern Arizona, and it's exciting here because they've had a very long history of recycling water for irrigation. But more recently, largely through studies and professional networks from water reuse, the community is beginning to explore potable water reuse. So even locally, I'm seeing the impact that the association and foundation have had.